When an eccentric former Hollywood actress swears she's being stalked, her friends and neighbors don't believe her. Then she disappears, leaving behind an enduring mystery. What happened to Yvette? Welcome back to Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime, a podcast that delivers the chills of a real-life mystery, retold in a way that makes for uninterrupted nighttime listening. I'm Nancy Miller, the creator of Dead Sleep, and for this episode of Dead Sleep, we're going to do something special. We're going to wind down the evening the way adults did on TV when a lot of us were growing up. We're going to end the evening with a nightcap. And not just any nightcap. It's a fortified wine that gave women a special power. It was called Harvey's Bristol Cream.
Until recently, I'd never have invited a man over for a drink. It wasn't considered respectable. But this is now. And when you're serving Harvey's Bristol Cream, it's more than respectable. It's downright upright.
Harvey's Bristol Cream.
I admit, I've never actually tasted this fine imported sherry. But those famous ads left an aftertaste. One that with a little liquid courage, a woman could invite a gentleman friend over for a drink. Harvey's Bristol Cream marketed itself as a classy beverage for the sexual revolution, a newly liberated woman who could make that bold move, the assertive but respectable vixen. And Harvey's Bristol Cream is a small but indelible detail in this gruesome Hollywood tragedy that has stuck with me since I first came across it in an extraordinary story first published in Los Angeles Magazine by Stephen McCullen. Now, I used to work at Los Angeles Magazine. I didn't edit this story. But I chose this story because it's a strange, haunting mystery. It's not a whodunit. It's more who didn't do it. Who could have done something that might have changed the outcome of one woman's life. And speaking of changing the outcome of one woman's life, your support makes a huge difference for this truly independent true crime show. No blaring ads or inappropriate interruptions. Just a mindful mystery that you can fall asleep to. Join now for $5 and you'll enjoy a bonus episode this Friday, which we'll get to later in the show. Right now, it's time to unwind like they did in the era of Harvey's Bristol Cream, in the super groovy late 70s. Slip into something more comfortable. Dim the lava lamp. Get cozy on that imaginary bearskin rug in front of that imaginary fireplace. Take a sip of your nightcap of choice, preferably inside a giant brandy snifter, and get ready to fall asleep with Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. This is the Nightcap. Yvette was being stalked. She was sure of it. Throughout that summer of 2010, she could see and hear cars along her dark and isolated streets, miles from the noise and bustle of everyday Los Angeles. As cars drove past, she wondered, anxiously, were they going to slow down? Because somebody was watching her. She was sure of it. She would tell her friends this, well, the friends she had left, often late at night, over the phone, after a few drinks. To be a Hollywood star means you're potentially having to deal with creepy fans violating your privacy all the time. And Yvette Vickers was a Hollywood star. Well, she almost was. Once. Yvette Vickers is not a household name by any means, but for those who do know her name these days, It might be because of the ghastly circumstances around her death just over a decade ago, in a set of strange and unnerving circumstances. The stuff of nightmares, yet painfully real. But before we get to the mystery of the end of Yvette Vickers, let's start at the beginning, at the dawn, in Hollywood in the 1950s. When Yvette was a promising young actress who seemed destined to be a star. She had looks and then some. In a sea of bottled blondes, Yvette's allure seemed natural and effortless. Her vibe was less blonde bombshell and more of a grenade, with a come-hither sex appeal that took a few extra seconds on screen, then knocked your socks off. She was ready to take on Hollywood. But was Hollywood ready for Yvette Vickers? Yvette Vedder moved from the Midwest to Southern California with her jazz musician parents as a young girl. At age 22, Yvette, who would later change her last name from Vedder to the slicker-sounding Vickers, made her big screen debut. Well, it was a bit part, but in a big movie called Sunset Boulevard. Even if you've never seen Sunset Boulevard, you know its most famous line.
All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up. The line was famously said by Gloria Swanson, who plays the iconic silent film star, whose age and ego turn her into a homicidal has-been. But that line also summed up Yvette Vickers, her career in a nutshell. She was a starlet ready for her close-up. It's just the close-up never came. From 1950 until the early 60s, Yvette would go on to appear in several films and stage productions. Yvette was always the giggly girlfriend, never the leading lady. Her most enduring fame came from a couple of sci-fi flicks, including the 1950s cult classic Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, where she once again played sexy second banana to the 50-foot main character. In the ups and downs of Tinseltown, one thing stayed constant. The place she called home. Yvette lived in a small 2-story cottage in Benedict Canyon, a woodsy, cozy enclave in the Beverly Hills area. It's rugged and rustic, with hilly terrain that, in its history, is known for its wildlife, coyotes, mountain lions, and, in more recent years, for attracting human predators. Benedict Canyon was where Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski lived, and where Tate and 4 others were murdered by members of the Manson family in 1969. Benedict Canyon was also the home of Susan Berman, the former friend of Robert Durst, who was found dead in her rented house in the canyon on Christmas Eve in 2000. Durst was later convicted of murdering Susan Berman in the fall of 2021. Up until recently, Yvette had lived in this home without incident. When had things changed? She was awarded the house after the first of her 3 failed marriages ended in divorce. Her first husband, a jazz musician, said one reason their relationship failed was because being a 20-something actress who was married hurt her chances at landing parts. "You can't play that casting couch thing to get jobs if you're married," he told Los Angeles Magazine in a 2012 interview. Yvette was also a social butterfly who loved singing and dancing. Landing a centerfold in a 1959 issue of Playboy magazine only enhanced her reputation as a party girl. Eventually, Yvette received more press for her dating life in the gossip pages than she did with any roles on screen. She wasn't much of a drinker. Not at first. But as she dated some of Hollywood's most famous leading men, who were also some of its heaviest drinkers, she seemed to fall under their influence. Eventually, the men went away. The work dried up, but the alcohol stayed, and the number of bottles grew as Yvette became more isolated. Her home was tiny by today's Beverly Hills standards, just under 700 square feet, and set into the hillside. But it suited Yvette, who mostly kept to herself. The whole neighborhood was like that, though. People were friendly enough, but were in Beverly Hills and they liked their privacy. Unlike most upscale homes in the area, Yvette's place had no security. No gates or hidden cameras, no special code to get in or a burglar alarm. The only warning that anyone was coming was a chain with tiny bells. Bells that jingled when someone opened the front gate. The massive sprawl of ivy in Bougainvillea gave the home a groovy, artsy vibe from a distance, but hidden beneath those choking vines and leaves was a house and an 82-year-old woman whose life was in danger. By that summer in 2010, when Yvette was last seen in public, the sculpted figure featured in Playboy magazine 50 years earlier was rounder and her face more full. That come-hither gaze was muted by a degenerative eye condition, rendering her legally blind. Yvette's mind seemed addled as well, friends would later say. In public, she was bubbly and charming, but in private, she was paranoid and suspicious, convinced someone was out there, stalking her. As an octogenarian out of the public eye for so many years, her crazed fan claims and stalking fears seemed improbable, but not impossible. In recent years, Yvette enjoyed a resurgence in popularity. A younger generation of film geeks knew and loved her from cult classics like Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. Yvette didn't know it all those decades ago, but those cheapy indie horror and sci-fi flicks would become hugely influential in ways that charted the future of the movie industry, and in ways that would hold women like Yvette back. Because these B-movies were made to attract younger people away from the television and into the movie theater. And those movies were based on a formula that would eventually be called the Peter Pan syndrome. And it followed a few principles. And those principles were this. Number 1, a younger child will watch anything an older child will watch. Number 2, an older child will not watch anything a younger child will watch. Number 3, a girl will watch anything a boy will watch. And number 4, a boy will not watch anything a girl will watch. Therefore, to catch your greatest audience, you zero in on the 19-year-old male. Sound familiar? That marketing strategy and overall sensibility would be used overtly and covertly across Hollywood, which would keep young male actors as the heroes and young actresses as the eye candy for generations. So in a way, Yvette, she got the best of what was available to her at the time, and thankfully, those movies had earned a whole new level of respect. Back in demand, Yvette started traveling around the country for paid appearances at film geek conventions and signed autographs for $20 a pop. Yvette could be gone for stretches at a time, from convention to convention, and since Yvette didn't like to fly, she traveled almost everywhere, when she could, by train. These meet and greets fed her ego as much as her bank account. Over time, a handful of Yvette's fan relationships developed into something more intimate, something between fandom and friendship. Yvette was alone and sometimes vulnerable. Fans who had grown close to her remember talking on the phone with her for hours. Sometimes she slurred her words, and nearly every time she talked about being stalked. Is it possible that she developed a relationship and made herself vulnerable to a scammer, or a stalker, or something worse. There were all kinds of stories about celebrities from the golden age of Hollywood who'd been manipulated by unscrupulous people who were after their money. But the scamming and manipulation of actors, especially older people, that was usually because they had money. And Yvette didn't have any money. She had her home, and that was it. In August of 2010, as phone records would later show, one of the last phone calls was reportedly believed to be with one of her admirers. Yvette did take precautions, it seems, to ensure her privacy. Yvette never invited people into her house. She'd insist on meeting people at a local joint called Hamburger Hamlet. And don't let the humble name Hamburger Hamlet fool you. Hamburger Hamlet was the place to be seen back in the day. Every major Hollywood star, from Frank Sinatra to Lucy and Desi, you name it, they were all there. And it was that way for years, up until 2011, when they closed the location of Hamburger Hamlet on Sunset Boulevard. And the Sunset Strip, honestly, was never the same. Yvette's home was visible enough from the street that if someone were to glance up now and again, they could easily see house lights on or hear the phone ring from time to time. Signs of life, in other words, proof that someone was there. Which is maybe why neighbors thought nothing of it when Yvette disappeared. If you can even call it that. Can you disappear if no one is looking for you? I am from the East Coast, but I've lived in California a long time. And I've noticed living in California, especially in Los Angeles, for these past many years, nothing can ever be just average. In Los Angeles, every single thing has to be a little extra, even the rain. And in December of 2010, the rain was fierce, epic, truly. According to the LA Times, back in 2010, Southern California got more rain during that December than in over a century. I remember it because the roof of my apartment building nearly caved into my bedroom ceiling and water rained down on my bed and bedroom furniture. And it wasn't just rainy. It was cold. Cold enough that you'd need a heater on, especially on a chilly, lonely Los Angeles night. It seemed that winter nobody left their house unless they absolutely had to. Neighbors wouldn't notice if someone was coming or going. The streets became like rivers. Mudslides tumbled down hills. And anything that was fragile, anything unstable, was threatened of being swept away. But then, spring. That long winter had created the greenest spring that Los Angeles had seen in years. Rich, verdant growth of vines surged with vigor, especially outside of Yvette's house, where her tangle of plants and vegetation already sprawled with abandon. In April 2011, one of Yvette's neighbors noticed something curious. There were cobwebs around Yvette's mailbox. As she investigated further, she noticed stacks of delivered but unopened mail that had been sitting outside for so long in the moist environment, the envelopes were covered in mold. She and Yvette were not close. She'd heard all the stories about Yvette Vickers, her eccentric neighbor, that she was known for walking up and down the street in her nightgown, martini in hand, that in her day, Yvette was quite the neighborhood dish, striking up romantic liaisons with the men who lived on her street. She liked to tell people she had sugar daddies in the desert. In these past several years, Yvette just seemed eccentric and cranky and paranoid. But this neighbor, Susan, was the unofficial mayor of the street. So she had a certain responsibility to find out what was up with Yvette's house. It just looked neglected and ramshackle. She wondered what was going on. She asked a neighbor to help her get inside Yvette's apartment and see what was going on. But no one else would help her. So she went up alone. She yelled Yvette's name several times, as loud as she could, but there was no answer. Now seriously concerned, the neighbor pushed her way into the house, and it wasn't easy. The front door was practically barricaded with trash and debris. Once in, she gasped at the conditions of the house. Ivy and bougainvillea grew everywhere, so did blooms of black mold. Amidst the junk were bottles and bottles of Chardonnay, and that signature drink of the liberated woman, Harvey's Bristol Cream. Yvette's neighbor, a successful actress herself named Susan Savage, punched, kicked, and climbed her way through this Escher-like hoarder's maze of decay until she finally pushed and crawled her way to the second floor. There was another closed door. Susan opened it. Oh my God. It wasn't about what she saw. It's what the neighbor felt. Heat. That's what the neighbor felt first. Susan looked around, catching her breath. It appeared Yvette had retreated from the hoard of her house to live almost exclusively in this tiny area of the house. Amidst the boxes and debris, Susan, the neighbor, spotted a small fridge, hot plate, and a landline phone with its receiver off the hook. Somewhere in the room, there was a hot, dry breath of a space heater, whirring and hissing, snake-like, behind balls of crumpled paper. It was claustrophobically hot, like an oven with the door closed. Susan, the neighbor, looked around, fearing the worst, but she was relieved to see there was no sign of Yvette. Where was Yvette? A few moments later, she noticed a pile of clothes close to the phone and a daybed nearby. She bent down to inspect the pile of clothes. And it was there she noticed a strange mass. Leathery, like the color and texture of beef jerky. One end of the mass was covered in spores of mold. At the other end were tufts of what looked like white shag carpeting. It took a beat to take in. That shrunken, leathery mass inside the pile of clothes? It couldn't be. Was that patch of frayed shag rug actually white, blonde, scraggly hair? She ran, stumbling and screaming, from Yvette Vickers' house and called the police. Speculation abound. Was Yvette right? Had someone been stalking her? Had someone broken into her house and done something to her? And it took some time for the medical examiner to look at the body and get the results. And the results were devastating. That Yvette Vickers wasn't murdered, but she died of natural causes, cardiovascular disease. Her cause of death wasn't unique. It's the way her body was found that grabbed headlines, giving her more attention in death than she ever had in life. What the neighbor had uncovered in that pile of clothes on that April day in 2011 was what happens to a dead body when exposed to constant dry heat. That would be the space heater Yvette had turned on in her room. That constant dry heat inside a small enclosed space had led to what the police and coroner's staff would call severe advanced decomposition / mummification. By the time she was discovered, her body was devoid of organs and had withered to just 56 pounds. It was unclear exactly when Yvette Vickers passed away, but based on the mummified remains, it had been several months, and no one could say for sure they'd seen her past August or September of that previous year, roughly 6 months ago. The strange thing was, her neighbors swore they saw signs of life, like the lights that were always on, which meant they assumed that Yvette was inside. And Yvette was inside, she just wasn't alive. So how was there still electricity and a functioning phone? Customer protection laws ensured Yvette's phone and electricity remained on, even if the bills went unpaid. It also explains how the heater created constant, dry, hot air for months that resulted in her body's distorted condition. Yvette Vickers had ex-husbands, distant family, and remote fans, all of whom expressed sadness upon the discovery of her death, but she had no one close enough to check in on her while she was alive. A local church held a service for her, for free. Movie stars and performers have had tragic deaths since the beginning of Hollywood. What was unique about Yvette Vickers was its inexorable pacing. It was a slow-moving tragedy, and one that maybe was misunderstood. Reading these old articles from over a decade ago was interesting. Her story back then is depicted as a creepy cautionary tale. Here's what happens if you don't make it in Hollywood. And with that came an even deeper warning, especially if you're a woman, and especially if you're old. And I look at this story differently now than I did way back in 2012 when I first read it, with less pity and more empathy. I'm not sure how Yvette Vickers would describe her early Hollywood encounters with handsy producers, the infidelities that broke up her first marriage, but we now know the so-called casting couch was much more fraught for women, of having to play the Hollywood game, the game where the men made the rules, but the women had to navigate it all with ease and the skill of a gambler trying to win against the house. Except, as you know, the house always wins. And also that at 82, her erratic behavior and paranoia chalked up to her being a drunk or out of touch and egotistical might have been signs of dementia, which is a disease and not a personality defect. Likewise was her drinking. As many of us learned the hard way during the pandemic, that easing loneliness and isolation with alcohol is a common coping mechanism, and not the exclusive moral weakness of a so-called Hollywood has-been. The frustration for me here is that the respectable vixen promoted in those Harvey's Bristol Cream ads, which clearly spoke to Yvette, and contributed to her problem drinking, which partially led to her downfall, was forged a few decades earlier by Yvette herself. She defined the respectable vixen who went after what she wanted, lived her life on her own terms until the very end. A promising young talent that probably deserved to be famous. And in the end, she was. Thank you for listening to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. If you haven't had a chance yet, I strongly encourage you to subscribe to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime so you can enjoy the Forensic Friday bonus episode that's coming out this Friday, May 17th. We put a lot of love and care into recreating a bedtime version of your favorite Forensic File episodes from the 90s. If you're a fan of the original show or not a fan of the original show, I think you're going to really enjoy it. And more important, be able to fall asleep to it. Until then, nighty-night.